going to wait just a minute till everyone streams in on Zoom. It takes a little while to let everybody in once we start the session. So just hold on for a second. We'll start in about a minute. So those of you that are just coming in, we're going to start in a minute. It takes a minute or two to let everybody into the Zoom room once we open it up. Okay, so I'm going to start. We'll still have people coming in, but I wanted to welcome you all to our last session on U.S. Peacebuilding, Shaping What Comes Next. I'm Liz Hume. I'm the acting CEO of the Alliance for Peacebuilding. And I just want to say, when we started talking about this, doing these sessions, I remember, Prabha, I was talking with you about it. We were talking about 4 or 5. We originally, thought, oh, May, June, no idea that we would be here the end of September, although we did take a couple of weeks off in August, that we'd be sitting here at the end of September, and we would have had such an incredible run. But it also shows you how complex conflicts are, conflict dynamics, the system that we're in, the resiliencies, both good and bad, who's contributing to it, what are some of the triggers, and what are the trends. Throughout the sessions, we really did focus in on what's the problem and really looking for those practical solutions. But we wanted this session to be a roundup of all of this, looking at, okay, what are we going to pull out of everything that we talked about and looked at, and what are the most practical steps that we need to take as a community, as a peacebuilding community, and greater than that, to help reduce conflict and build sustainable peace. And when I was going through the sessions, I did a quick survey of the sessions. We went over addressing systemic racism in the US, the future of rural, immigration. We talked about education, toxic polarization, both from the left and the right. And what do they have to do with it? Police, public safety, and how that has triggered significant violence in the United States. We talked about mental health and neuroscience, how it impacts solutions and how it drives conflict, even looking at mass atrocities in the US, community level programming, and how we need also a bottom up approach, the role of dialogue and narratives in this conflict, the role of private sector, and violent extremism, which is some of the main topics that we hit. But we also talked about democracy and also elections. And that's a really key issue that I want to get in with our panelists today, that, even if we do everything else, what do we do if our elections aren't free and fair? There is an article that came out this week in the Washington Post talking about our constitutional crisis is already here. So, we have to ask ourselves, what can we do about it, if anything? But really, this session is going to do a wrap up on some of those key drivers and some of those trigger points, but also really look at the leverage points that we have, and what do we do about it? So that's really the point of the session today, this wrap up, and then we'll be moving into PeaceCon, which is scheduled for, we changed the date due to the Democracy Summit in December. So it'll be January, I believe it starts on the 26th. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but the 26th, 27th, 28th, and the first day will be in conjunction with USIP. So we invite you to please sign up for PeaceCon. We'll be talking about US peacebuilding, building off these sessions there. The request for proposals has been extended until October 8th. So please send in topics and ideas for the conference, and please attend. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Michael Collins from the Institute for Economics for Peace. And he's going to talk a little bit about the drivers, and then we're going to go through a round. Shannon Hiller from Princeton, and I'm sorry, I forgot the name of your institute. So when you get to, you can tell me what your institute is. Prabha from Mediators Beyond Borders, and the Trust Network. And then Kira also, who's coming just a little late for Urban Rural Action, will be here as well. So we're going to go through the panel, talk a little bit about some of these key drivers, and then do another round, really looking at, okay, what are those leverage points that we need to be focusing in on? And then we'll have time for question and answers. So with that, Michael, take it away.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Liz. And I will go ahead and share my screen very briefly, if that's okay. You should all be able to see that properly. And, you know, you may or may not know that IEP, the organization I work with, does a sort of a lot of global analysis with regards to peace and conflict. So I just wanted to kind of sort of bring that to bear somewhat, but obviously focusing down on the United States. A number of you may be familiar with the Global Peace Index, which essentially sort of ranks peacefulness around the world. The number one ranked country is the most peaceful, and the least peaceful country is 163, which is all of the countries that we track. And as you can see here, the United States presently is in the position 122. So actually not particularly positioned very highly when it comes to sort of global measurements of peacefulness. It does, you know, it is kind of sort of a multidimensional analysis, right? So it does take into account a large variety of different factors, but generally in terms of sort of global comparability, the US does poorly in things like incarceration, homicides, access to weapons, and a lot of elements related to its high levels of militarization as well. Now, the US, as you can see here, is essentially less peaceful than it was 12 years ago, and it's been deteriorating significantly in peace since 2016. It's down currently 12 places, as you can see. Now, the North America region, which basically only includes two countries, the Canada and the US, saw the largest deterioration in peacefulness last year. Peacefulness in the United States dropped an overall of 3%. Now, I just wanted to sort of bring this particular slide out here just to note that this isn't necessarily, or that some of these deteriorations aren't necessarily exclusive to the United States. So, for example, if we look globally at levels of civil unrest, especially since that kind of sort of same period of 2015, we've seen a significant increase. Now, a number of you may also be sort of familiar with this framework here, and I wanted to bring it up because what I've just shared now, you know, the fact that violence is increasing is certainly not news to anybody, and we're here today to talk about some of those root causes. The sort of the positive peace framework that you see here kind of helps us look at some of those underlying elements. It's essentially a distillation of our research, and it sort of flips the script somewhat because it's based on elements that strongly correlate with peaceful societies. But it can serve as a way of predicting drops in future peacefulness, and to be able to kind of sort of unpack elements that may be contributing to deteriorations in peace. So the first thing I wanted to say about the United States in our measurements of positive peace is that it still does relatively well, in the sense that it's currently sort of positioned at the 31st place. It has been deteriorating significantly over the last 10 or 12 years. And once again, the North American region, primarily, if not entirely driven by the United States, is actually the only region worldwide that has deteriorated in positive peace over the same time. I just wanted to focus on sort of a couple of things here. On the left-hand side, you can see sort of these indicators, which we serve as to conveniently, I suppose you could say, track levels of positive peace on an annual basis. Don't read too much into these indicators because although they're good for tracking purposes, they're kind of just an initial layer of many, many indicators that are kind of sort of somewhat behind these. But nonetheless, it does allow us to see these major deteriorations here and elements related to the quality of information. So primarily the quality of the information that governments put out, or the amount of fake information, that the institutions provide. Factionalized elites, these refer to sort of fragmentation of state institutions along ethnic lines or class lines, racial lines, or religious lines, for example. And then an increase in group grievances, which is related essentially to the divisions between different groups in a society. Now, this kind of sort of speaks a bit more broadly to what we call this deteriorations in the attitudes domain, which is what I kind of sort of like to show you here. We sort of split all of these indicators into attitudes, institutions, and structures. And whereas we generally see worldwide an ongoing sort of improvement in positive peace indicators related to structures and institutions, we see in the US this significant deterioration in the attitudes domain. Now, once again, this is not exclusive to the US, but may kind of sort of provide us some guidance as to potentially some of the things that are going wrong. One of the elements that is actually sort of more salient or perhaps more worried for me in this chart is actually not so much this line that you see here showing this deterioration in this domain, but it's actually this one here, which shows a deterioration in peacefulness. I think I mentioned this already, but when we look at positive peace, we generally see that the strength of institutions on average worldwide continues to improve over time. Institutions progressively get stronger as and when they learn, as they develop new systems and evolve. That is not something that we are seeing here, right? We're seeing this deterioration in institutions. And, although this is perhaps not sort of a very, an IEP specific view, it makes me personally wonder whether this is kind of sort of beginning to track very much in the same way that this would. In other words, this is kind of sort of being led and pulled by this deterioration in the attitudes domain that we see here. So I think I'll leave it there and be able to sort of jump into potentially some of the policy implications a bit further on. But as a partial segue to Shannon, what I wanted to mention is that a lot of the stuff that you see here is global data. And of course, you can get a lot more richness, a lot more granularity when you're able to look at certain dynamics at an even more local level. So I'll leave it there and I'll hand it back to you guys.
So Michael, I just want to ask you one quick question before we move on to Shannon. So you're saying that you think the attitudes, that line that's not going well, do you think is that, and that's what we know about conflict, right? It can be real and perceived grievances. Is that, do you think that it could be causing what's happening, or it's tracking with what's actually happening? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And ultimately, it gets down to the bottom of the question that we're all asking ourselves. But there's a danger there when talking about causality. And this is why one of the reasons why we always talk about correlation. And that's because invariably these things always feed off each other, right? In the same way that if you wanted to connect these two lines and say that weakening institutions contribute to deteriorations in attitudes, and deteriorations in attitudes then contribute to the weakening of institutions. So it's kind of a bit of a chicken and an egg scenario, but I think the important thing is to recognize that dynamic and recognize that complexity, because then that provides us with more tools to be able to deal with it.
Okay, thank you. Very clear. Okay, Shannon, take it away.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks, Michael. I'll also just share some quick slides here and get them set up. I am Shannon Hiller, the director of the Bridging Divides Initiative at Princeton. Let me make sure this actually goes. Can you all see the main slides right now?
Yes.
Great. No matter how long the pandemic goes on, I will never do that smoothly, I guarantee. But as Liz was saying, I'm at Princeton with the Bridging Divides Initiative. We focus on tracking and mitigating political violence, specifically in the US, with a focus on providing information to support community-led approaches to both mitigation and linking to long-term reconciliation. So as Michael said, I'll be digging more into 3 trends in demonstrations, which we know aren't by themselves sort of trends or causes for concern, but then 3 specific behaviors or elements of that we might want to track more closely as well, and kind of dig into some of the things that might be behind some of the more macro level trends he was mentioning. For this group, I don't think I probably need to belabor the fact that COVID, racial justice demonstrations, and the election itself were really driving mobilization at the end of last year into the beginning of 2021. In some ways that's continued, in other ways it's become a little more complicated this year. So if we had done this presentation back in July, you would have heard me talking about COVID-related demonstrations really tapering off. That's the chart in the top. I left it because it was so starkly changed in the last couple of months. You can now see that the tail is trending back up due to the surge in Delta, especially the reinstatement of mandates of masks and public space mandates. And I would say too, the political use of both. While before COVID demonstrations were actually a mix, they related to eviction moratoriums, they were in support of health workers. This last spike has been much more anti-mandate, anti-mask in the last couple of weeks. We also see that, last year was an exceptional year when it comes to racial justice demonstrations. So it's no surprise that there's been less this year. But certainly issues of race and equity have persisted in a lot of different types of trends. One that's been in the news lately, obviously, is around critical race theory. And you see, there's been some good work done in how the media environment is driving offline behavior around that. We also saw in some of the for and against types of demonstrations, state legislation was also bringing people to demonstrate. So this stylized map that you see here shows all the states that introduced some type of legislation, and whether or not it passed, it drove people to go out and support or in opposition to it. We also see that that's continuing and driving some of the concerning trends that I'll talk about in just a minute. Just this past week, there were several anti-CRT demonstrations around schools in Ohio, and it included counter-protests and the types of things we often watch out for additional conflict dynamics. And while in sort of previous times, we might think that election-related demonstrations would drop precipitously after an election, again, no surprise here that we haven't seen that entirely. Some of these are kind of general demonstrations about voting rights, elements of the voting institutions themselves. But as a way to transition into some of the more concerning trends, we also see persistent activity around the stolen election narrative, and that it intersects with other issues. So here we're drawing on ACLED data, armed conflict location and event data, that's now going on 2 years in the US. They tracked at least 500 Stop the Steal events over the past 2 years. Less than 100 of those have been since January 6th, and even less since inauguration. But at least 20 have been in the last 3 months, and they've been around. Stop the Steal has been brought into a host of different types of events. So it includes protests in response to Biden visiting locations. Around what we're visualizing here calls for partisan forensic audits in states that have already concluded the sort of regular audit approach to verify the election. It's involved groups like the Proud Boys and other right-wing organizers as part of those demonstrations. It's intersected with anti-mandate, anti-vaccine activities. And most recently, as former President Trump has gone back out to public rallies, he's repeated claims of a stolen election at those rallies themselves. So transitioning into the ways in which, these are protest trends by themselves can be a good thing that people are choosing to protest about issues of concern, but things that we're seeing around it that have persisted that we're tracking. One is threats to officials, especially local officials, and that we're starting to get a better sense that those officials, not only is it cross-cutting, it's not on a single issue, but also that it's forcing some, or it's having the effect of some officials deciding to resign and actually leave public service. So this is one area, as we get into some of the recommendations, where I feel like we lack good comprehensive national data. The Department of Justice has just started a task force on threats to election officials, but it's quite recent effort. And we know that just demonstrations alone don't really capture the before and after. Oftentimes demonstrations and the activities there result in calls or other threats in addition to public officials. You see a headline here from Idaho from an anti-mask event where a leader was facing a tough decision and felt like even the decision itself would lead to more threats. I also think this is an area where we could have a lot better information on who's most often getting threatened. Is it women? Is it other groups that are disproportionately affected? But we can dig into that more later. One of the questions that also comes up most often is what's the activity that was sort of in response to COVID, racial justice demonstrations, and the election by unlawful paramilitary and armed actors? Has that continued into 2021? You can see here that there's certainly a decrease in the baseline, but that it's persisted. And so as you saw some of these actors linking to different issues, this baseline continues and has the real potential to increase again. That's also because while we have seen some fracturing of specific groups after the arrests and the ongoing charges after January 6th. Some of the groups have continued and have in some ways have found new avenues to gaining followers. So some of you may have heard Cassie Miller from SPLC and Hampton Stahl from ACLID on NPR just this morning talking about the Proud Boys. And the ways in which they're engaging on these issues that have continued and finding new ways to work at the local level. Finally, as one of the sort of trends of concern specifically, mis and disinformation, and especially when it leads to calls to violence, it just sort of exacerbates some of these trends and link into sort of specific incidents that we can see. And so while rare, are particularly concerning. So this is just one example around the use of cars as weapons. It's a little busy, but you can see this is some of the data we've put together previously around car rammings at demonstrations, where the sort of narrative of Antifa buses and misinformation about Antifa coming to small towns, combined with memes about using cars as weapons against protesters. Actually, we also saw car rammings disproportionately against Black Lives Matter demonstrations. And you see sort of similar themes coming up again, even in anti-COVID demonstrations. This example of a health official in Michigan was from just last week. So these trends are persisting and linking to other issues that are particularly contentious. And y'all, I'm so tired of ending on depressing information. So I thought I might add a slide that sort of alludes to some of the policy recommendations. I think talk about more positive trends. Some of you may have seen that coming out of the events of January 6th, Andy Kim's act of cleaning up the Capitol actually sparked a bunch of fan art. So I think there's an opportunity to kind of, even in some of these really concerning trends, there are elements that we can build on where folks can agree upon common positive narratives coming out. So I'm looking forward to getting into that more with everyone here. So thanks.
Thank you, Shannon. That was, yes, I remember when he did that, and it was Mr. Rogers used to say, in the midst of a horrible crisis, look to the helpers, look to somebody who's doing something positive. I misquoted that, but you get the gist of it. And I have to say, when I saw him doing that, I thought about that, cleaning up the Capitol like that. So thank you. I wanted to actually say one thing about what you discussed. I was just looking at some data from the Southern Poverty Law Center the other day, and it was interesting to note that the number, there had been a real spike in hate groups. The number, it looks like, has declined, but incidents and hate and extremism have not. So I thought that was just an interesting trend of what's happening. And maybe even if people are going underground or consolidating, I didn't know. So I didn't know if you had any data on that. It would it'd be interesting to hear what you have to think about that.
Sure. Well, one of the things I always wonder, especially with US hate crime data, is there's just such a bias against reporting. And so the FBI data is incredibly imprecise and has huge gaps geographically. You know, we use ADL's heat map to look at what's still oftentimes self-reported incidents. So while I think that that it's very sort of the qualitative evidence supports that there's rising hate incidents of a variety of kinds. I think there could be a good news story in there too, that we're getting better at reporting and finding it.
Sure.
So
well, the instances are going up, but the number of groups has gone down a bit. So that's, I think, the interesting piece of it is if these groups are going underground or consolidating, or, you know, so I think that's the interesting piece there. But
right. I mean, I think that the same, another thing we're careful about with the groups themselves is even if there's just a few groups, but there's huge membership, then you have the same challenge. So, and the same with, you know, what we've thought a lot in this past year, the geography of groups. We see that people are, one of the things about the trends that we were just discussing, they've been motivating people to travel pretty significant distances to commit some of the worst violations. And so I'd be cautious linking the decrease in to too much, but I think it's never a bad sign when you're seeing numbers about hate groups going down in some sense.
Okay, thank you. So Kira, are you here yet? She was teaching a class and was coming a little late. If not, we'll go to Prabha and then we'll come back to Kira. Okay, Prabha, you're on.
Oh, you know, when we started talking about this and this series, I looked back at something we did. This is almost exactly a year to the week of when we started the Trust Network, with the idea that there needed to be some kind of a national infrastructure that integrates what we have seen work and dynamics that play in the fields of peacebuilding, social racial justice, and democracy and governance. And it was with that idea that we started. And MBBI had a conference to which we had invited Alice Indurito, who is now the Deputy Secretary for Genocide Prevention at the United Nations, who also happens to be one of the founders of the Uwiano platform in Kenya, to come and do engage or facilitate an analysis. And I'm looking at these factors that she walked us through at that time, which were scary as all get out and should be. And I'm just going to use this view for now because I'm not spending a lot of time on it. And what she asked us to look at was these factors. Do you see any of these risk factors listed below in your home country? Went through all of these, and you see from the indication of how many people thought these were prevalent in the United States. If you can't read it, it's increased poverty, poor infrastructure, unemployment, armed civilian militias, public discontent with the economy, repressive policies curtailing civil liberties, silencing of opposition politicians, demonizing journalists, corruption, radicalization, militarization, drug trade, hate speech, religious tensions, use of violent language in media, high numbers of crimes. At the end of that, as all of us in the audience in very high percentages that you saw identified those factors prevalent here, she said, you know, this is the index I used in Rwanda. And I think for many in the audience, it took that moment to recognize that we are in crisis. And as Michael so clearly pointed out, There is a prolonged global democratic recession that has in recent years morphed into something even more troubling, the third reverse wave of democratic breakdowns that Samuel Huntington warned could follow the burst of the third wave of democratic progress in the 80s and 90s. And every year for the past 15 years, according to Freedom House, significantly more countries have seen declines in political rights and civil liberties than have seen gains. And that already ominous trend since 2015, as you heard the last two speakers point to, has actually turned sharply worse. 2015, 2019 was the first 5-year period since the beginning of the third wave in 74, when more countries abandoned democracy, 12, I think, at the time, than transitioned to it. Only 7 transitioned to democracy. So why is this decline in democracy important for us as peace builders and policymakers to pay attention to? What I want to focus on are 3 factors. And the first I come to with very much of an approach that those of you who've been in the field will recognize, and I think Rob Risigliano has written eloquently and a lot about it. And what we talk about is that we need to think, let me start by the first one saying we need to think beyond binaries. In the last year, we've seen a lot of conversation about red versus blue, rural versus urban, coastals versus those in the middle of the country. What stressed systems tend to do is descend to binaries. It is a pull, it's simplistic, it does not serve us well. It's too simplistic to categorize anything along those binaries because there are multiple complex factors operating, factors that require systems change, which is what brings me to the work of the systems change actors, which is that the change requires us to operate in ways that are often unfamiliar, even counter to traditional ways of working, because while we need to see the world through this complex system lens, the tendency is to look at problem solving. And you've all heard about cloud problems and clock solutions. The clock versus cloud distinction is based on the insight that most challenges lean towards 2 different kinds of categorizations of these. The complicated, predictable, controllable, bounded clock problems, the unpredictable, hard to control, endless, and evolving cloud problems, which require us to do completely different things. And I want to set this frame because I have been in too many meetings in the last few months where I have heard people say, if only people knew, if only they had the facts, if only we did this 1, 2 things. What we are facing, what Shannon and Michael have described, and what the series that Liz is referring to has described, is that it's incredibly complicated. And we have to complexify how we think about these. We can't solve or fix these things in days. We need to shift and heal and look at decades-long possibilities and actions. So that shift became very clear. The third, I would say, is the importance of looking at the neurobiology. I think Mari's was one of the presentations. There have been a couple on neurobiology and why this is important. Why do conflicts erupt so easily? Why do people so easily follow leaders who promote divisions? Why do facts matter so little to some people? I mean, if you all recall, in both Brexit and the Trump campaigns, leaders used their rhetoric not to appeal rationally to followers' interests, but to appeal emotionally to their instinctual and emotional predispositions. The Brexit debate was dominated not by sober analysis and evidence-based reason, but by hysteria, hatred, emotions, the sinister monster of exclusionary ethnic nationalism. Because so much of this is unconscious, I think it calls upon us to be multidisciplinary practitioners who understand that neuroscience, neuropolitics, neurobiology is now being used in neuromarketing, economics, law, and in the peace building field, what the fMRIs, I was a therapist in the 80s and 90s and working with people impacted by traumatic experiences. And at that time, what we were finding was that the functional MRIs were actually giving us the solid scientific evidence for what we as clinicians were seeing in our clients, in our practices. And now I think it's come to the point where it's pretty clear that our brains differ along a continuum, that the fMRIs have shown that these differences influence differences in attitudes and beliefs that Michael was referring to, and that if we have to get smart about the way we work, we have to integrate neurobiology. Saying if we just keep continuing to share the facts, the truth is on our side, facts are on our side, we have to understand that our efforts, most people need to belong more than they need to be right. And those require us to approach this very differently. So the last thing I will say at this point is that a lot of what Shannon referred to is the differences in how certain dynamics play out locally. So I cannot emphasize enough what has been effective is that we need to engage, support, and I'll get to this in the policy recommendations and the funding section, but we need to engage our local actors. And I have been, saying for the last year that there are resources in this country that no other country has. There are thousands of peace building, social cohesion, and community building organizations that we can build on. We need to speak about them differently and raise their voices. And I also don't think hyperlocal action alone is enough. We need to build the national infrastructure to make the connection between what is happening locally to fit into the national picture so that we can share and learn from each other. So that's a lot of what we've been doing in the past year. And I didn't say who I was. If you don't know, my name is Prabha Shankar Narayan. I'm the CEO of Mediators Beyond Borders International and one of the co-conveners of the Trust Network.
Thank you, Prabha. I like how you were talking about the complexity and the decades long. That is, this is going to be a long haul problem. It's not a short fix as well. Okay, Kira, I know you're on. Are you there? I saw you. Did you disappear?
No. Well, okay. I don't know. That's me.
Okay, Kira, take it away.
Okay.
I know you were a little late coming in, but feel free to talk about some of the issues that we're seeing. And I know you are from I had introduced you before you came from Urban Rural Action. So, please tell us some of the key drivers that you're seeing concrete grievances. And then we're going to do another round, really looking in and have that be very conversational to talk about, okay, what do we do about it in this complex system, as Prabha has reminded us about. So, thanks.
Well, thank you. And apologies to all of you for coming in late. As you all know, I had to teach a class that just got out. So I'm grateful you let me join, even though I couldn't be here at the beginning. And I'm sorry I missed what everyone else had to say. I will have to watch the recording because I'm very interested in your answers to this question. But what I did hear from what Prabha was saying as I came on, I think, yeah, right, all of that, and then turn it to the rural communities in this country, I think we need to think about the extent to which, when we talk about making those connections and coming to these common understandings and building that kind of community, to the extent to which rural communities are often left out of that conversation and out of those connections and out of that community building. Rural America for many decades has been sort of otherized as a group within the context of American culture and the American discourse. It was not always thus, but it has been for recent years. And I think we're seeing the natural consequences of that, the natural consequences of this sort of caricature that we've built of the rural American as a white, conservative Trump voter, and nobody else. And the sort of lack of nuance, which leads, I think, often to an approach to rural America, which is much less about building understanding and coming to the table together, and much more about how come these communities can't get with the program? What's wrong with them? And unsurprisingly, that leads to some resentment and a little bit of kind of closing of ranks. That dovetails in a really problematic way with a troubling strategy, I would almost call it, of lack of investment in rural communities, even rising to the level in many cases of disinvestment in rural communities, ranging from education and economic development to things as simple as internet access, healthcare. The pandemic has highlighted a lot of those disparities, but it did not create them. They were there, and now they're sort of thrown into stark relief by a lot of the things that we've seen in the last year and a half. So I don't actually have any idea if I'm answering the question that was originally asked, since I wasn't here to hear it. But if we're asking what is the problem, what is the issue when we look at the urban-rural divide, I think a fairly deep and entrenched lack of understanding on the part of both communities of the other community, the rural communities of urban and vice versa, is something that both underlies that problem and is a consequence of it. So we're not talking about solutions right now, but I think that also hints at what some of the solutions therefore might be. Is that good, Liz?
Yeah. Okay, so let's just dive into okay, so what do we do about it? And we don't have to go in the same order, in a really complex system. I mean, I tried to simplify it, and I asked them, okay, if you had 3 or 4 things, where do you think, we need to be focusing in on? I know probably you already talked about, obviously at the local community, but you have to scale it up, but you also have to be working down because we have this national infrastructure. So that's, I think, a really key part of it, making sure that those are connected, up and down. But what are the key things that we could be doing and really, focusing in on? AFP has done some, right? We've really been working with the Department of Homeland Security on the violent extremism portfolio that they have there, making sure that the money is there, that they're focusing more on upstream prevention, less on the securitized, as an example. Really trying to push the government towards creating something that looks like a NED, a democracy program, which is really hard because it doesn't fit anywhere in our government. So, I mean, those are some of the things, just a couple of things that AFP has really been pushing. That one is to kind of get out the violent extremism issue, but at the same time, also focusing in on how do you rebuild that democracy. At the same time, we've been very vocal around in looking at some of the triggers, police violence, unjustified killings, murder, and what needs to change. And it was incredibly disappointing to see the George Floyd crime bill fail or kind of disintegrate this past week. So we've continuously said, if you don't reform, if we don't get a handle on that, that's really one of our triggering violence indicators. So with that, kind of gave you a little bit of what my thinking is. It's not exhaustive in any way, shape, or form. So I'll start with Michael, but everybody please jump in and kind of have this as a conversation and talk about okay, I've done this conflict analysis. what would I recommend country X to do based on the data?
Thanks, Liz. And I mean, one of the things that I wanted to kind of sort of retouch on, because of from my perspective, the criticality is the systemic nature that Prabha was talking about, right? The inherent complexity and kind of sort of the relational aspects between all of these different components. And just to add another kind of sort of layer of complexity on that, the emergent properties that any system has, right? And that's something that can be both positive and negative, that can be used to our advantage should we be in a form of virtuous cycle, but invariably adds a level of complexity and unpredictableness to things when we're moving in sort of the opposite cycle. And that, you know, it doesn't come down to one single piece. When we get right down to the bottom, we realize that there's nothing there. Prabha was referring to neurobiology, but we could equally talk about quantum physics in the same kind of sort of way, through the same principles. And this kind of sort of speaks again to this kind of sort of like chicken and the egg scenario that we were talking about before, Liz, and how all of these things are intertwined and sort of build on each other. Just to get a bit more concrete, I did have a sort of a couple of thoughts, if you will, and it does relate to the institutions component. I definitely think that there's an opportunity for there to be sort of more awareness of the damage we are doing to the institutions, and reinforcing the fact that you know, institutions should be considered a global good, right, or a national good at the very least. I mean, the US has kind of sort of taken a significant hit to its pride. We all have sort of a tendency to blame each other for this. But, you know, I think in many ways, it's very important to hold up those institutions, but also for the institutions to kind of show you unity as well. And in that respect, I know that we're in a room full of mediators. I mean, I feel that there needs to be a good old kind of sort of fashioned mediation process at the level of Congress, because many of the basic mediation sort of principles are really, really not being applied. And you know, I kind of sort of more broadly sort of reinforce this value of highlighting consensus and aspects and things that are actually working kind of sort of very well. I mean, this is also a very traditional sort of mediation technique, right? Which is to focus on the commonalities, focus on the mutual strength, focus on the mutual benefits. Shannon, you highlighted it very well in that last sort of slide that you had. There is very, very little, if any, of this currently. So I definitely think that's an opportunity. And probably sort of the last thought in relation to that is actually, in terms of what an overall recommendation would be, is to continue to do what we're sort of doing, right? Is having these conversations. You know, IUP, we've got this sort of this process of change that we use, and we spend a lot of time having speaking engagements like this, doing training workshops, sharing our research far and wide. And the purpose of that is to actually get the message out for people to be able to digest some of these components related to systemic thinking, related to positive peace, et cetera, whatever they may be. But by talking about these things, by exposing them, by generating the conversations, I think in many ways we actually underestimate the impact that organizations such as AFP, that organizations such as Trust Network, et cetera, are already having. So I don't think that we should forget that. I think it's important. So for God's sake, continue to do what you're doing.
Thank you, Michael. Shannon, I'll just go back in the order we were. Shannon, what are some key things that we should be focusing in on?
Sure. Thanks, Liz. I mean, I think everyone has already said what's sort of top and most strategic on my list, which is just the fact that we can't have a security only approach to these challenges, that it really has to be a whole of society approach. And that we've experienced this so many times before in different issues and forums, that the easiest tool is often the security tool to reach for. And it may be one of the components, but it especially when the security sector is one of the drivers of some of the problems, as you mentioned, Liz, it definitely can't be the only one. I also alluded to a second one, which links a lot to our work, the idea that the data and the analysis that we're collecting at the national level really has to also be for local actors, and not just in a one-way kind of transmission sense, but as much as possible, a two-way conversation. Not just because those are the folks who often can use that information now and most practically, but also because I think that also helps the communities that are many times most affected feed back into the analysis and help flag when we see concerning trends. I think here about the two large demonstrations in DC before January 6th, when there was an attack on a historically Black church, and now resulting in charges because a banner was torn down. It's been tried as a hate crime. Those of the many indicators, that was one leading into January 6th, and connecting with local communities, even in a city like DC, isn't always happening in the way it should. So as I mentioned, I really hope that efforts like DOJ's task force on election threats aren't just collecting in to the national level, but are also engaging out about what they're seeing and actually thinking of building trust with communities as part of the mandate of efforts like that, not just as kind of a one-way relationship. The other two that I would mention, we, all of us, I think, talked about kind of what are the short-term trends, but the long-term ways to address the root causes. And I think, as tough as it is, the issue of critical race theory is a good example, in that this is fundamentally a conversation about, how we should think about history in our country. So you might need to, in the short term, manage what's a contentious meeting or a contentious issue, but what are the programs that would actually help us have that conversation in a productive way? So we released a recent guide about managing the meeting itself if it's going to be contentious, but I know a lot of folks in AFP's network, mediators and others, have the tough task of creating space for that larger conversation, which is so fundamental to everyone. What are we going to teach our children? And that's definitely not going to be like an uncontentious conversation, but how do you have it in a space that moves us forward and not back? And I think there's a lot of great programming that can happen there at the local level, and will make, will have an impact even if it's not immediate. And I'm glad that Michael liked my, sharing some of Andy Kim's cool fan art. There's so much more, so I encourage you all to check it out, I think, on his Twitter feed. But sort of how we think about January 6th, I think, is going to be really important. So how do we create a common narrative that's not actually, that's at least close enough, when in fact, I'm more worried that we're diverging further and further in how folks see January 6th and what it means in terms of the legitimacy of our institutions. There's some practical things. I think you mentioned at the top, Liz Robert Kagan's article. He was suggesting that there should be a much bigger coalition in support of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And when I think about common narratives, people like John Lewis is someone that people hold up as someone everyone admires. And so I think it can be time for us to put that admiration into practice in supporting a lot of our democratic institutions.
Thank you. I'm just going to continue on, Prabha.
Sure.
What's working out there? Because you guys are doing some great work.
Exactly. And I'm also looking at some of the questions and comments from Danielle and Victoria and a couple of others, and thinking that those responses can, yes, don't we all need inspiration these days? We do. There's no question about it. And that's why I am grateful for forums like this, because I think so often I learn and hear about what is happening that we need to share much more about. So the one thing I will say is that we are beginning to, as Michael said, what we are beginning to see is that what we know about what's happened in different parts of the world, we are bringing and integrating with what we know is effective, from Kentucky to Rhode Island to Nashville to whatever city you can think about. I think the idea that it needs to be unique and customized to the local context is really something that resonates. Everybody gets that. At the same time, we're not pretending that we have nothing to learn from each other. So when international actors like IEP, like Search for Common Ground, like Partners Global, like Peace Direct are saying, here's what we've seen in other parts, and we're bringing people together to say, let's see what of that might apply. So we are beginning now to have conversations to see what we can learn from each other. And I would encourage you to go to AFP's site, look at their list of members, go to the Trust Network, look at the list of resources there, and begin to use some of those, because we are creating from the local and the global context a very unique language for the United States, because the dynamics here are very unique. I'll give you one example of what's working. As you said, as a conflict mapper, as an analyst, what we need to do is follow the data and the science. And what we've done in some cities, there are examples. Portland is extraordinarily complex. What's happening in Virginia, in rural Virginia, is extraordinarily complex. And sometimes it feels like you have to run a sprint and a marathon. And athletes know how differently you prepare for each one of those. It's really hard to run for a sprint and a marathon, train and prepare and run a sprint and a marathon at the same time. And yet I feel like every day that's what we're doing. But that is what is called for, right? So what happens in some places is that there is a wonderful collaboration due to the advocacy efforts of AFP and all of the members, that there is a public-private partnership. I think it's really time for us to help funders in this country understand why even those like not just the peace-building funders, the peace and security funders, which quite frankly are a tiny percent of the philanthropy in this country. There are social service funders, there are children and youth funders, the Casey Foundation, there are hundreds of those, which I think is really important for us to think about. How do we inform each other about the systemic changes we need to make that we're talking about? So I think funders looking at making these kinds of, approaching it as a cloud problem and saying we can come together for public-private partnerships. So in Portland, the community, for example, invited us and said, come and do something here. So we started with a mapping and analysis process, which was privately funded. The next stage is that DHS has funded a couple of organizations in their interventions that builds on the previous effort. And what we hope is that the entire community gets engaged in this process, which is a reflection of many of the dynamics that are true nationally, but expressing themselves very uniquely in Portland. So those kinds of examples are working. I could go on with lots of examples, but I think that kind of bringing funders and policymakers to understand that it's not just the democracy funders, it's not just the peace-building funders, it's not just the social service funders. There are leaders. Nancy, who used to run, who was the head of USIP, is now at Packard. Melanie, who was at AFP, is at Humanity United. There are amazing women, and I'll think of a few men soon, I'm sorry. There are amazing women who have been really working hard at educating the funding community about the need for integrating our funding and thinking about our funding more collaboratively rather than in the sectors they have always operated. And I think it'll take that kind of movement. That's the one thing I would say. The second is really to follow the data. BDI's, ACLED's data has been amazing. They've helped us in the last year identify hotspots. We are now moving with those cities and states at the most risk. So in Pennsylvania, for example, the governor's office is very interested in a trauma-informed approach to violent extremism. And that's what we are starting to do here. And at the heart of all of these efforts are local centers. Some of them are community mediation centers, some are not. Pittsburgh, my hometown, doesn't have a community mediation center with this capacity. So we'll be looking for another local convener. And that is the convener that Shannon is referring to, who can create the space for this conversation to happen. We're going to be doing one in Pittsburgh, one in the rural part of Pennsylvania, and looking at what approaches to extremism that have worked in other places can be effective here and how can they be localized here. So for me, those are the kinds of things with a whole of society approach that include the local institutions and citizens groups that are beginning to work.
So Prabha, I think this is really insightful. A couple of things I was pulling out while you were talking. The US is not a monolith, so we can't treat it as a monolith. You're gonna have to take solutions and tailor them with, working with the community and make sure that they are tailored in that local community. And I say, people have heard me say this 1,000 times. If you can't fund it, you can't do it, right? So what is this complex system that donors have to be looking at? And how do we get, you didn't express it completely, but I think I know where you're going with this on the public-private partnerships, is that the private sector has to get involved. And it doesn't mean they need to take sides, but they need to, because in some ways, sometimes they cause the problem, sometimes they help the problem, and they need to get more involved, even at the community level. So that's what it's going to take. Okay. Kara, looking at some of the other issues that we're having, especially focusing in on rural America.
Yeah, so I as I'm listening to everyone else talk, these are all wonderful thoughts and maps forward, I guess I would call them. And the one thing I would say is that we have to be really careful to make sure that everyone is at the table. And that that these efforts, as well intended as they are, aren't leaving out rural communities in particular who tend to fall by the wayside when we have these high level conversations, which usually take place in urban environments. And one thing that occurred to me as we're talking about all this local focus, which I think is really important, absolutely, is that at the local level in rural communities, it's very hard for people who are inclined toward this kind of work, peace building work, to engage in their own communities. There's really rural communities are not a national priority. And so if you want to do that kind of work and you're from a rural background, you end up either leaving or at the very least focusing your attention at the national level. And that has to change if we're serious about engaging rural communities in the kind of work that we're talking about here. Rural peace building has to be a national priority in a way that it really isn't right now, but I think easily could be. I think everyone wants it to be. It just hasn't sort of come to fruition in a meaningful way. And I think Pablo was talking about this common narrative we need to build. Now, maybe that was you, Shannon. And again, I feel like we need to make sure that narrative includes the rural narrative and rural communities, and not just the ones that we're already familiar with, maybe.
Liz, there are
a
couple of things I just wanted to, as I'm reading some of the questions, this is not my understanding, so I want to be very clear that complexity for me actually means not a top-down approach. Addressing complex systems at the local level that are connected. We have to make the vertical connection if we have to learn from each other. But addressing at the local level means that there are different complexities in different local contexts. And so saying, oh, let's do what Kira's doing in Clarion County in Pennsylvania, in Memphis, there may be parts of it that work, they may not. So I think it really is a part of what I have learned a long time ago as we've done the work in countries around the world. I mean, I started as a community worker in Pittsburgh. Most of what I learned in Pittsburgh because we engaged in communities. If you went in Pittsburgh, there are 3 rivers, and what people will tell you is they don't cross the rivers. So what happens in the North Hills, people in the South Hills don't know. I mean, that's how local it might get. But the point, I think, is that it needs that kind of a conversation and the reality that the underlying issues are historical, right? I mean, we haven't mentioned that so much of the identity conflicts so much of the conflicts that we are seeing also have to do with identity based in race and religion. that's a huge factor. I remember the Ipsos report talking about how people of different political parties identify. So the fact that race and religion have become major identifiers is something we have to take into account. And how that looks in one community is going to be very different from how it looks in another. So I think if the community foundations in this country, and I think there are hundreds of them, actually said, let's all focus our attention on building social cohesion, equipping local communities to ensure that there is at least one organization with the capacity to bring people with differences together, that would be a huge infrastructure boost. And so think about the fact that every national organization is looking at building the local capacity, not to address every problem, but to figure out how we work together to do it at the local level. And every local community mediation center, not every community foundation then says, this is how we're going to direct our funding. And then they identify what it is they want to address. It may be reimagining police in one community. It might be coming together to mourn the losses of COVID, as a community in Alabama is doing, because how it affects communities looks very different in each one of these places. And what we also know is what I will say is, I have not found coming together for the sake of coming together very effective. People come together to accomplish something, to do something, to solve a problem. I wouldn't even call it peace building in this country, frankly. We are problem solvers. We are designing solutions for things communities are facing. Those are the issues, whether it's water in community or in one community, flooding in one community, or again, the mask mandate in another. Coming together to solve problems, to me, is far more effective than just talking about each other. We do need to talk to each other, but we need to do more than that.
Okay, so at the local level, so a bunch of questions have come in. At the local level, what can you give one example of the advice you would give at the local level? And again, this is hard because it's not a monolith, but one or two examples, if anybody has, in terms of what they have seen actually working at the local level that has had some impact.
I'll give a quick, and I want to hear Kira's example too. I mentioned earlier this de-escalation resource that we put together with a couple of other groups, and I think I myself can sometimes hear, oh, another toolkit, another tool, like a piece of paper. And so I think the way that that's an example, though, is it was in response to local officials getting people showing up, in the words of one of our collaborators, causing a ruckus. And officials and volunteers at the meetings felt really disempowered. They didn't know what they could do in that moment. And so these different guides give a bit of a roadmap to what you could do to prepare, and then the skills that you might bring in the moment. And I think those then are the actions that can have an impact. We worked with a DC Peace team, who they train folks who can do nonviolent intervention and nonviolent communication. So we see that that preparation then can make a difference in the moment to take the temperature down, and not create a new conflict on top of the ones that's being discussed. And that can make space for then later conversation. So that's where a lot of our work focuses on mitigating what might actually escalate to create space for those longer activities. And it can be things as tangible as reaching out to people on both sides of an issue ahead of the meeting, thinking about whether your community is actually, it create more tension to have police presence. Are there alternative security solutions that are more appropriate for a particular meeting? And so it gets back, though, to what everyone said on this panel. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution. So how do you provide some support to folks who are making those tough decisions in their own community?
Mm-hmm. And where do you point out, I know you guys have done a lot of work on this, where do you point out where things are going well? looking at, riffing off of Amanda Ripley's, that's the heat map you're talking about, right? In terms of there are some areas where things are actually going really well. So how do you do that?
Right. Well, I think one of the ways we like to think about, we can use the data approach to find where to look, but then oftentimes you end up using a qualitative approach to say, well, is this to use Amanda Ripley's term, is it constructive conflict or is it high conflict? So it may be that we're seeing some indications earlier in the year that it could be on the wrong track. You look more closely and there's actually a lot of community engagement on that issue that's making progress. So I think that the match of using the data to know where to look and then listening to folks who actually have a sense of what direction the community is headed can then better, you can understand the specific dynamics.
Okay, so there's an individual, Joseph, who's been chatting and putting some questions in there, really talking about how angry people are at the local level. Can you have a conversation with them? Is that, how do you do that? His point is 70 million people chose Trump and they aren't interested in having a conversation with anybody. What do you do there?
So I think go ahead, Michael.
Well, I was actually going to refer to some of the comments that you previously made, actually, Prabha, which I thought were absolutely hitting the nail on the head in many ways. I mean, a lot of the, despite the fact that we have talked about peace building, that I myself have talked about mediation as well, a lot of it also comes down to, if not, it comes down to basic needs, right? And the peace building element is actually, in many ways, less about peace building or resolving conflict in the way that we've become habituated to think about it. It's more about the basic delivery of basic services, of basic rights, of essentially all of the the different pillars of positive peace, as it were. I mean, some of the most successful initiatives that I've seen in the US have been ones that have essentially touched on all of those different elements, extremely local projects that are built entirely around improving levels of governance, improving the free flow of information between different community members, providing a plethora of resources for the community, generating community meetings, providing spaces for entrepreneurship, et cetera, et cetera. So kind of sort of very basic things, but are a fundamental concern to everybody involved. Now, I'd probably disagree with Joseph in the sense that perhaps people don't of all persuasions don't want to sort of talk about politics. I certainly don't want to talk about politics either, but we do want to talk about what our basic needs are. And if somebody is there to support us or want to support us, we want to be able to, I'm assuming, we want to be able to express our point of views and to express our needs. And as Prabha, as you said, those needs are completely different in completely different contexts, and it's completely different in urban and rural environments. And different with all kind of sort of different social divisions. So I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, Joseph, but I don't think it's a question of not wanting to have a conversation. It's about not wanting to have a conversation about things that don't interest you, right? So the question is, how do we get to the point in which we talk about things that you are interested in? And then how can we build off of that?
Yeah, I see that there's a lot of people have been posting in the chat, crossing party lines, Braver Angels. There are a lot of organizations out there to help, get people to be able to have these conversations. I'm also going to point out too, it's not about having the cross, and we talked a lot about this with what has the left got to do with it. People have to do a lot of intra-group work, both on the left and the right. It's not always just about crossing that divide. So I'm sorry, was somebody going to say something on the panel?
I was just going to mention that is actually exactly what our organization does. I can't remember who said what at this point, but the idea that just having the conversation isn't enough. And I've been involved with Braver Angels for many years, and they do a great job of helping people talk to each other. But often that's where it ends. And what Urban Rural Action tries to do is equip people with explicitly equip people with skills to have difficult conversations about difficult issues, explicitly equip them with skills to analyze problems in their community that they have identified themselves, not that have been identified for them, but that they have come together to deal with. And then help giving them support to tackle those issues with meaningful action across all kinds of party lines, racial lines, religious lines, all kinds of divides, including geographic. And so, for example, this Saturday, I'm going to Baltimore City to participate in the second part of a workshop that we're running right now across the state of Maryland. We've got people from the way western rural counties. We've got people from outside of DC. We've got people from Baltimore City, all coming together to talk about economic development in Maryland. And as you guys have all mentioned, of course, economic development, healthy economic development looks different in different places, even within the same state, but it's interconnected, and recognizing that interconnectivity and understanding where someone in Hagerstown, Maryland is coming from addressing that issue, particularly here post-COVID, versus someone in Montgomery County, Maryland, versus someone in Baltimore City, that understanding is a necessary building block for then creating these projects that teams work on in collaboration with community partners to actually make change. And I think it was Prabha who said, you're exactly right, that people are unwilling often, or they lose interest quickly if it's all just about meeting someone different. I mean, that's kind of interesting for a while, but what people really want to do is make change. And they need to be equipped with the skills and supported to make that change. And that's a big part of what urban rural action does. So whoever asks what you can do on the local level, you can get involved in a program like that.
Well, and I think, one of the things that we are finding is people are increasingly interested. Well, one thing I will say is those 70 million, that's not a monolith either.
That's right. That's right.
We have to really remember that this categorization is something within each one of us we have to be extremely mindful of. I am nothing but curious about talking to people with a different perspective. That general curiosity before assuming that somebody who voted a certain way or lives in a certain place or reads a certain book has a certain value is really problematic. Where is our curiosity? Why aren't we asking more questions of curiosity about what people care about? In my community, when we organized a few years ago, they threatened to ban an educational program. I'll use this as an example. It is relevant today. They threatened to ban an international program. And I happen to live in a community where people who are working in multinational companies come because there is a program in which their children can join without skipping a beat, no matter where in the world they come from, right? And there was a vocal outcry about this program. It wasn't even that expensive. Some of you may be familiar with the International Baccalaureate program. And we organized for 2 years until the majority on the local school board was voted out. Now, 15 years ago, this was an issue on school boards across the country in the same way that the mask mandates and CRT are becoming an issue in school boards across the country. So skill up is one of the things we all can do. How do I reach out to people locally? And the reason I put the resource page from the Trust Network there is there are lots of resources. What we're finding is one of our partners is Black Women for Positive Change, and they are promoting legislation for de-escalation skills amongst community members. And it's becoming increasingly something that people are identifying as wanting, because they're recognizing that interactions at the grocery store, at the school board meeting, everywhere, the tension levels are up. And let's remember that our baseline of anxiety has gone up in the last 18 months.
Yes.
I think we really have to keep that in mind. There's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of resentment. There's a lot of deep sadness. 500,000 people have died in this country. How can you not address any conversation without acknowledging that? So I think that basic humanity in all of us, no, I'm not giving a toolkit. You can find that on the website. I'm sorry, I didn't come prepared for those kinds of things. But what can you do locally? I would say get engaged locally in a way that allows you to be constructively engaged, productively engaged. Pick an issue, find a local convener, and say, who's addressing problems together? Who's convening? What can I do to skill up on de-escalation skills? When there is a rally, those de-escalation skills can be really helpful. So if you're somebody who calls your legislators, ask them to support that bill. If you're somebody who works locally, take a de-escalation training so that we can engage in our local communities with a few more skills. So I think there's a lot we can do. I think of this as a time for national service, no matter what we are, not just for peace builders.
I also, you touched on something that came in as a question, so I want to get to that. The role of behavioral psychology. And I think probably you hit on it because I don't know about any of you all, but when I started coming out, after, the pandemic is still here, but when things started lightening up in terms of restrictions, everybody was so angry, whether you were at a store. It was, and I thought everybody would come out and be really happy that they were out. We've lost a lot of ability to communicate. So how, this is our new baseline, but what does this, how does this fit into this and this trauma that everybody has experienced in this country?
Yeah, Liz, I might try and link that to something I wanted to follow up on from Prabha's too, because I've experienced the same thing. This is a big deal that we're coming out of slowly but surely. And while it's impacted us all in different ways. I think, we've all talked about some of the positive ways people can engage. And I want to be careful that it doesn't sound like we're saying, de-escalate, it's all about dialogue. There are also important moments where people need to stand up and say, this is unacceptable behavior. This is harm and dehumanizing and, a threat to our community. And I think that can link to, the ways in which we need people to be setting, specific norms to their group, the technical set better norms to your in-group, speak to the folks where you have credibility. And that can be a local activity too. And so, here I'm thinking about some of the, thinking about some of the really concerning rhetoric where people are talking about replacement theory and the ways in which kind of dangerous white supremacist discourse is edging its way into some of the conversation. And I don't think it should be a controversial thing to say, actually, the vast majority of Americans reject that. And you can speak up about that at a local level and in your own communities. It doesn't matter whether you're a Biden voter or a Trump voter, like that's something that we agree on. I think though that as we're coming out of COVID, as we've had all these strange ways of engaging with each other, Americans are notoriously bad at holding two concepts in their head at the same time, I think. So yes, we should have dialogue and talk to, voters, sort of make it more complex, but we also should say, no, there are certain things that we reject together that are too far, create harm to the community that we want to create. So.
All right, so this, peeling this onion a little bit on the psychology of it, what do you talk about? How do we address that? Anyone?
I'm reminded of a couple of things that came up in several of the sessions, and it's going to sound very simple. And I'm just going to say a couple of them. I think for me, it's a constant reminder. Let's have compassion for our nature as human beings. Remember that fewer people have changed by logic than by experience and emotions. We talk about increasing the supply of oxytocin in mediation. our common experiences. While it's hard to eat and drink and be together, as we are coming out, finding ways to build the credit of positive experiences together is really important. We can't delve into this deep, serious work if we don't have some credit built up of positive experiences together also.
That's right.
So I think those are some things I would say. And facts, yes, they are very important. But so often, who says them? Finding groups and messengers who are credible for the small subgroups of this population in this country, I think is really critical. And I don't know how else we try to ensure that we create a society where we are at our best.
Okay, so sorry, go ahead, Michael.
Well, I was just going to say I realize this is going on YouTube. I'm not sure if I'll ever see it, but my father-in-law and I disagree politically in fundamentally every aspect, but we both love motorcycles, and it's the love of motorcycles that keeps the peace in the house, right? That's kind of sort of like the central point that brings us together and allows us to be able to, in many ways, have very productive conversations on political components in a way that doesn't get it out of hand. So, it just kind of sort of came to mind based on what you were saying, Prabha, and perhaps in some ways, sort of trying to reinforce that aspect of kind of sort of finding what we have consensus upon and building upon that.
Which we've done a lot overseas. We go into a community, you pick a project that people work on, and you bring people together to solve a common problem over a well, and you're working with different minority groups, for example. So I just want to point out, we've been doing this work international, and there's been a lot of organizations here locally in the United States that have been working for a long time. I don't want to say, we're at a violent global conflict problem at a 25, 30-year high. So things are not good globally. And you're seeing, democracy backsliding in places like the United States and the UK, which is contributing to it. But I think the most thing that I've gotten out of this session, I've gotten a lot of things, but I learned Michael likes motorcycles, but one of the things that I would not have guessed that. One of the things that, it is about changing this narrative, building this awareness raising, and focusing at this national level, but also really looking at how do we dig down into this local level. And the work that has to happen, almost as a national service project. And so that's a lot of the things that, and a big focus on this narrative, right? Of changing this narrative, and from a psychological perspective, knowing what works and doesn't work. And so I think that's a big piece of it, and understanding. And a lot of times in countries, when you have a big issue that happens, like 9/11 in the United States brought everybody together for a period of time, and not always in the right ways. Many other communities suffered, like the Muslim community in the United States was very targeted after that. But COVID is one of those things that should have brought people together in the United States. And in fact, it's one of the things that has pulled us farther apart, and been used and weaponized. So I don't know what the answer to that is, so that you have these big national issues, but also the big local issues, lots of big local issues. But, on COVID, just using that as an example, focusing in on, I even see our leaders do it now, shaming people for not getting a vaccine. That's not going to work. The fact that get vaccines into the hands of local doctors. People trust their local doctors. Let them go have a conversation with their local doctor, for example. So I think that there's so much rich data out there and stuff that we know based on what we've done and worked overseas, that it has to be applied here. And I see, sometimes I just cringe when I see so many things happen. And even peace builders, people that have worked overseas, and I know how hard it is. This has also showed us how humbling it is to try to work in your own country. It's really humbling. And I've made many mistakes along the way. So I think that that's really an important thing to point out. But I just want to thank everybody. And I want to thank the audience, and there are a lot of great questions that came in. A lot of great resources were put in the chat. So we're going to be collecting those and also be putting them out. This isn't the end because of PeaceCon. We're going to be moving these sessions, or some of these sessions, into PeaceCon. And really, again, looking at, okay, taking the pulse again. It's a couple months from now. I think, Michael, you said it. I think it was you said it well. Conflict isn't static. Is either Shannon or Michael. It's not static, and this is a changing dynamic. Who knows, in a sense, what could be the next trigger right now, and really pushing our government and donors to be funding these types of programs, because that's what it's going to take. All right, so we're at time now. I want to thank everybody and especially you all here at the end, for wrapping up this incredible series that lives online at the Alliance for Peacebuilding, and we will be putting out a report on it. But I want to thank everybody for their time and attention, and for their amazing analysis throughout the process. So thank you.